Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. We're talking about the retirement of Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy from the United States Supreme Court and how President Trump's selection of a replacement could change the direction of the court for a long time. We're joined now by Bruce Ledowitz, Professor of Law at Duquesne University, and Anne-Marie LaFaso, the Arthur B. Hodges Professor of Law at West Virginia University. Welcome to you both. Is this, David Hickton, our previous guest, said maybe this isn't as big a deal as it seems right now, as analysts and reporters are making it. Professor Ledowitz, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a big... I think David's point was that, you know, we run the country and democracy not on the court. So if the court overturns Roe versus Wade, it returns it to politics. If the court overturns Obergefell, same-sex marriage, returns it to politics. I think the point he's making is that ultimately the people can decide these issues themselves, even if the court changes direction, which is fortunately true.
Right, but because Kennedy was this swing vote who tended to go with the conservative, who tended to go with the liberal bloc on some social issues, including Obergefell, same-sex marriage, abortion, people have said, oh, this is a potential earthquake in the way the court's going to operate from now on. If instead of Anthony Kennedy being at the center, it's John Roberts. What do you think about that?
Yeah, John Roberts will be at the center, but I also don't think it's as big a deal as everyone's making it out, in that I think there will be shakeup in our precedent, just as there was some shakeup this week in our precedent in terms of labor rights, but also Korematsu was overturned. And I think that actually was foreshadowing that the court is willing to disagree with stare decisis, that stare decisis, while it's an important principle, is not the only important principle, and that if they think that the decision was wrongly decided, no matter how old it is, that they will overturn it.
Give me the 10-cent definition of stare decisis.
Oh, sorry. Stare decisis is precedent. So it would be Roe versus Wade. And so it's the idea that this is now settled law. Okay,
which the president has said is his position, so it suggests that maybe that's not as big an issue for him, same-sex marriage, as Roe v. Wade, perhaps. The president has said he wants...
nominating a Supreme Court justice is not like ordering at a Chinese restaurant.
Understood, but you know that that's the subtext, right? People will say, oh, there's no litmus test, but you know, certainly for Collins and Murkowski, they were two Republican senators who are hedging. It seems to be because they want some guarantee that they won't be voting for a justice. And there's many ways of asking the questions.
Well, right, but
hearing.
If you're the kind of justice who's going to overturn Roe versus Wade, you may also be the kind of justice who's going to overturn Obergefell. That's what I mean.
I agree with that.
He can't just say, well, you're going on the court to overturn Roe, but leave Obergefell alone. It's just not possible.
And if you look at, everyone's talking about Kennedy as a moderate, but if you look at this previous year, many of his decisions lean toward the very conservative. So,
in labor law, they're always conservative. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
You didn't.
Oh, that's what they do here.
That's fine. No, go ahead.
Yeah, for example, in labor law, he was never progressive, particularly progressive. And so it's not going to necessarily change as much as people think. The most common decision on the Supreme Court is a 9-0 decision. Only something, I think it's 19% or 5-4. So we're looking at those, now that 19% are things like Obergefell and Roe versus Wade, things that capture the American imagination. But what's not going to happen is if they do overturn Roe versus Wade, then it's not going to mean that abortion is unlawful or illegal. What it means is that that in West Virginia, abortion will be unlawful, but you can't get an abortion in West Virginia anyway. That's the reality.
And it doesn't also mean that states that begin trying to establish new restrictions might find a friendlier court than they did with Anthony Kennedy on it?
Well, no. What they'll do is, I think, what they did in the 80s, the case will go up on a new restriction, and the state will argue that, in addition, Roe should be overturned. So you won't litigate very long just on restrictions.
It would get to Roe v. Wade pretty quickly.
It would get to Roe v. I mean, that's what happened under President Reagan. So I think that's what will happen here.
Right.
A year ago in the Post-Gazette, you argued that when Kennedy resigned, and you said it was inevitable, so you presaged this, that the same-sex marriage ruling could be in danger.
Well, the point of this is that we were making some progress. I have supported same-sex marriage for many, many years on the record. But I wasn't all that thrilled with the Obergefell decision itself, constitutionalizing it, because the process by which the states were voting for gay same-sex marriage was a very healthy one. Because every time a state voted for same-sex marriage, protections for religious believers were built in, and there was a kind of compromise spirit that was part of the adoption. There were several people working in the Pennsylvania Senate before Obergefell was decided, trying to get the Republican majority, would have been more or less the first time, to propose such a bill, legalizing same-sex marriage with protections for religious believers. When you can offer something on both sides, you can really clear the air, and you know, it's something not everybody would be satisfied with, of course, but you know, everybody would get something. So the political process is in some ways healthier. Now, I'm not saying people should, you know, you can't take away people's rights. So to that extent, I thought it was a very important case, but you know, politics can sometimes be more lasting. If it had all been done by statute, we wouldn't be talking about the court.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Kennedy voted in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage, but he voted against the baker who didn't want to make the cake for the same-sex couple, correct?
No, he voted for the baker.
He voted for the baker.
Yes, he wrote the Baker opinion, the Masterpiece Cake Shop.
A religious liberty decision.
Yes.
In other words, so he defended the right of the baker to not make the cake.
Right.
So on the one hand, in Obergefell, he wrote, marriage is marriage. But then in the bake shop case, he wrote, well, no, maybe not.
Well, no, not that. I mean, it's just
that's how it seems.
Right. Well, fair enough. But you know, the right to marry can allow for the right of dissent against that right to marry. You know, we let 1,000 flowers bloom. You don't have to. Everyone doesn't have to agree. I think that's what Kennedy was saying.
There were also some special factors in that case that suggested that Kennedy might, if it were different, have voted differently in that case. Like, I don't think we're going to see in like the local Kroger that you can't sell a cake to a gay couple. So there were very special facts that when, unless you read the decision and you're a trained read legal doctrine, that you would just see it as, well, he's pro-marriage here, pro-gay marriage here, pro-same-sex marriage here, and against same-sex marriage there, you know? So I think he was a very strong advocate for constitutionalizing same-sex marriage and for gay rights that will be probably almost certainly lost if Trump's person gets through. But I think a bigger thing that may happen is actually the Chevron doctrine, which no one's talking about right now, which is the doctrine of giving deference to administrative agencies in their interpretation of statutes. And Neil Gorsuch is basically suggested that he doesn't like Chevron. I believe also Alito may have.
Thomas.
Oh, definitely Thomas.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to see is a big shakeup in administrative law that
absolutely.
No one's talking about right now.
And so, another part of Justice Kennedy's legacy, though, I think is not in danger, and that's his death penalty juvenile cases. I don't think they're, you know, he was instrumental in the fact that juveniles cannot receive the death penalty, they cannot receive life with imprisonment without parole, without a hearing. I think those precedents, which were also 5-4, but I don't think they're in danger at all.
And what could be interesting with the death penalty cases is if you have someone who's very strongly pro-life, who knows, maybe they would actually vote to overturn, make unconstitutional the death penalty.
Well, that's interesting, but you know, there's never really been a pro-life vote on the court. I mean, the position has been that you know, the Constitution says nothing about this.
That's right.
There's never been a pro-life vote on the court, and I don't think there will be.
And that's why Roe v. Wade is what we're not in danger of is that Roe v. Wade would actually be overturned, and then that abortion would be criminalized, because under this idea of a right to life.
Right.
So, yeah, I agree
there's
with
not a single judge in public life that we've heard about who really takes that position now.
Do you think it's possible we'll see a female nominee? One reason some people are citing is, well, if Collins and Murkowski are shaky, perhaps a female nominee would go a long way to assuaging concerns that that this nominee might be might be the type of justice who would look disfavorably upon Roe v. Wade.
Well, it would make a great deal of sense, even if you found a woman who was already on record as saying that Roe should be overturned. it would have much more credibility if
Just
there were
optics-wise, or
another.
what?
No, but another voice with understanding of the experience of women who, nevertheless, thinks that Roe versus Wade should be overturned. I mean, everything would be preferable in this realm with a woman justice, but I haven't heard anyone actually mentioned.
Yeah.
I think I agree. I think that that Trump will play to his base. That's been a very successful strategy for him, and that what we'll end up seeing is a white male. We will see tit for tat, meaning that we're going to see this completely polarized. That the Republicans feel that they're owed this. The Democrats feel they were
robbed.
harmed, they were robbed of their candidate. The best thing that Trump could do is actually put Merrick Garland on, but he won't do that. He's gonna go right to his base. That's what he always does, and that's right out of his game book. And we're going to see further polarization.
It's too bad. It's too bad that these hearings are such lies. Because whoever it is has already made it clear to somebody whatever the president wanted. And it's too bad that American people won't find out the same thing the president already knows.
Interesting point to leave that on. Thank you both so much. We'll be back with some final thoughts in just a moment.